My mother stood up in front of 30 guests at my daughter's 6th birthday party, raised her glass for what I assumed would be an ordinary toast, and instead used the moment to announce, loudly enough for every single person in my backyard to hear, that I had always been the parasite of this family, living off everyone else's generosity. 3 months later, her kidneys failed, and out of our entire extended family, I was the only compatible donor. My name is Christina, and this is the story of the most complicated ethical and emotional decision of my entire life. Forced into being by a mother who spent decades treating me as fundamentally less valuable than my siblings, right up until the exact moment her survival depended entirely on my willingness to give her a piece of my own body. I want to explain the specific family dynamic I grew up navigating, because I think understanding its full depth matters to understanding just how devastating that birthday party toast actually was, and why the subsequent medical crisis created such an impossible ethical knot for me to untangle. I'm the middle child of three, with an older brother, Patrick, and a younger sister, Jessica. From essentially my earliest memories, our mother, Diane, maintained what I've come to understand, through years of therapy, as a genuinely consistent pattern of favoritism. Patrick, the oldest, celebrated for every achievement, however modest. Jessica, the youngest, protected and indulged in ways that shaped her entire adult personality. And me, positioned, seemingly from birth, as the family's designated helper, the child expected to contribute without complaint rather than the child, entitled to be celebrated or protected in her own right. I want to describe what this actually looked like in practice throughout my childhood, because I think the specific, accumulated texture of decades of this treatment matters to understanding the full weight of that eventual birthday party toast. When Patrick struggled academically, our mother hired tutors and celebrated his eventual passing grades as though they represented genuine triumph. When I struggled with a difficult math class around the same age, I was told to simply try harder, that tutoring wasn't in the family budget for someone who should just be more disciplined. When Jessica wanted a particular expensive item, a specific brand of jeans, a class trip, eventually a car for her 16th birthday, our mother found the money, however tight our family's finances genuinely were. When I asked for considerably more modest support throughout my own adolescence, I was reminded, consistently, that money was tight, that I needed to understand the family's financial realities in ways my siblings apparently never needed to. By the time I reached adulthood, this pattern had calcified into something I'd learned, through painful experience, to simply accept as the unchangeable shape of my family. I would help, I would contribute, I would show up reliably for every family obligation, and in return, I would receive considerably less genuine warmth, celebration, and support than either of my siblings, an arrangement that, over decades, I'd internalized so completely that I rarely even consciously registered its unfairness anymore, simply absorbing it as an unquestioned fact of my particular family structure. I remember, specifically, my own high school graduation, an achievement I'd worked genuinely hard for, having managed to graduate as salutatorian of my class despite the total absence of any tutoring support throughout my more difficult subjects. My mother attended, but spent much of the celebratory dinner afterward discussing Jessica's upcoming freshman year plans, an event still nearly 2 years away at that point, rather than engaging much with my own actual achievement that same evening. I remember feeling a familiar, quiet disappointment I'd already learned, by that age, not to voice directly, understanding through years of accumulated experience that raising the comparison myself would likely be met with defensive dismissal rather than any genuine acknowledgement. I want to describe some of the specific adult life examples of this pattern, because I think they matter to understanding just how deeply entrenched this dynamic had become by the time of that devastating birthday party toast. When Patrick's first business venture failed, costing him and his wife nearly $40,000, our mother organized a family meeting specifically to discuss how everyone could help support them through the difficulty, ultimately contributing a significant portion of her own modest retirement savings toward helping them recover. When my own husband lost his job for 6 months during an industry-wide downturn several years ago, creating genuine financial strain for my own family, I received a single, brief phone call from my mother, offering sympathy but no practical support, along with a somewhat pointed comment about how important it was for young families to maintain adequate emergency savings, a comment that landed, given the specific double standard it represented, with particular sharpness. When Jessica went through a difficult divorce 4 years ago, our mother essentially moved into Jessica's apartment for nearly 2 months, providing constant emotional and practical support throughout the entire crisis. When I went through my own significant health scare 3 years ago, a serious car accident that required weeks of physical recovery, and left me temporarily unable to drive or manage many ordinary daily tasks. My mother visited exactly twice during my entire 6-week recovery period, both visits brief. Both conversations focused primarily on updates about Jessica's ongoing post-divorce adjustment rather than any sustained attention to my own recovery. I want to be honest that I'd spent years before that birthday party trying to understand and even rationalize this pattern, telling myself various explanations, that my mother simply related differently to each of her children based on our different personalities, that Patrick and Jessica genuinely needed more support during their specific crises than I did during mine, explanations that, in hindsight, required a considerable amount of self-deception to sustain across literal decades of consistent, observable favoritism. The birthday party itself was meant to be an entirely ordinary, happy family celebration. My daughter Emma's 6th birthday, a modest backyard gathering with extended family and a handful of Emma's school friends, the kind of event I'd hosted without any particular anxiety or expectation of drama for each of my daughter's previous birthdays. I want to describe the specific moment everything shifted because I still, even now, struggle to fully understand what actually prompted my mother's outburst that particular afternoon. She'd arrived seemingly in an ordinary mood, participated normally throughout the early part of the party, until, during what I initially assumed would be a simple, brief toast to celebrate Emma's birthday, she stood up with her wine glass, tapped it for attention in the way that typically precedes a toast, and instead launched into what became an extended, devastating public critique of my entire adult life. I remember the specific quality of that afternoon leading up to the moment everything changed, a warm, ordinary early summer day. String lights I'd spent the previous evening hanging across our backyard fence, Emma running around with her friends in a princess dress she'd insisted on wearing despite the heat, the comfortable, familiar chaos of a successful children's birthday party unfolding exactly as I'd hoped. I remember feeling, in the moments right before my mother stood up, a genuine, uncomplicated happiness watching my daughter enjoy her celebration, no sense whatsoever of the devastating turn the afternoon was about to take. "I just think it's important," she began, her voice carrying a strange, deliberate calm that made what followed somehow more disturbing than if she'd simply been visibly angry. "For everyone here to understand something about Christina. She's always been the parasite of this family, taking and taking, expecting everyone to accommodate her, while never actually giving anything back that matters." I remember standing frozen in my own backyard, my daughter's birthday cake still uncut on the table beside me, watching 30 guests, including my own daughter's 6-year-old friends and their parents, absorb this completely unprecedented public attack, unable, for several devastating seconds, to fully process what was actually happening. My mother continued for what felt, in the moment, like an unbearably long time, though I understand, from later conversations with my husband and my sister-in-law, that the entire outburst likely lasted less than 2 minutes. A compressed, devastating litany of grievances I'd apparently accumulated in her perception across decades, framed publicly, in front of my own child's birthday guests, as evidence of my fundamental selfishness and worthlessness as a daughter. I want to describe what happened immediately after this outburst, because the specific, disorienting quality of trying to manage a child's birthday party while simultaneously absorbing this devastating public humiliation remains one of the more surreal experiences of my entire life. My husband, Marcus, moved quickly to my side, guiding my mother, gently but firmly, away from the immediate gathering, while I focused every remaining ounce of composure I could manage on ensuring Emma's actual birthday celebration continued without visible disruption. Cutting the cake, leading the singing, projecting a normalcy I absolutely did not feel throughout the remainder of that devastating afternoon. I didn't speak to my mother for nearly 6 weeks following that birthday party, needing significant time and space to even begin processing the depth of what had happened, understanding, with a clarity I hadn't previously allowed myself, that this outburst represented not some isolated, uncharacteristic moment, but rather the sudden, public surfacing of decades of accumulated resentment my mother had apparently been quietly nursing throughout my entire adult life. I want to describe the specific medical crisis that arrived roughly 3 months after that devastating birthday party, because the timing itself introduced an ethical complexity I genuinely never anticipated needing to navigate. My mother's kidneys, already compromised by long-standing, poorly managed diabetes, failed acutely, requiring immediate dialysis, and, her nephrologist explained during an emergency family meeting, an eventual kidney transplant if she hoped to avoid a lifetime dependent on dialysis treatment. I learned about this crisis through my brother Patrick, who called me directly, his voice carrying genuine panic, explaining the medical situation and the urgent need for family members to undergo compatibility testing to determine potential living donor matches. I want to be honest about the immediate, visceral complexity of my own reaction to this call, arriving as it did less than 3 months after my mother had publicly humiliated me at my own daughter's birthday party, calling me a parasite in front of 30 witnesses, including my own child's friends. Patrick, Jessica, and I all underwent compatibility testing over the following 2 weeks. I want to describe what it felt like, sitting in that testing facility. My own emotions genuinely conflicted between the ordinary, instinctive desire to help a parent facing a serious medical crisis, and the very real, unresolved pain of a public humiliation I hadn't even begun to fully process before being asked to consider literally donating part of my own body to the person who had inflicted it. The results came back roughly 10 days later. Neither Patrick nor Jessica proved to be compatible matches, due to blood type and tissue compatibility factors entirely outside anyone's control. I was the only sibling who matched, a genuinely rare and specific medical compatibility that meant, practically speaking, that if our mother was going to receive a living donor kidney rather than waiting, potentially for years, on the considerably longer deceased donor transplant list, I was the only family member capable of providing it. I want to describe the specific, agonizing weeks that followed this discovery, navigating what I've come to understand through extensive conversation with my therapist during this period, as one of the more genuinely difficult ethical dilemmas a person can face. Weighing my own legitimate anger and hurt regarding decades of documented, consistent mistreatment, culminating in a devastating public humiliation just months earlier, against the very real, immediate medical reality that my mother's life and long-term health depended significantly on whether I chose to donate. I want to be honest that I didn't reach a decision quickly or easily. I spent nearly 3 weeks in intensive individual therapy specifically working through this decision, alongside difficult, extended conversations with Marcus, who was careful throughout this entire period not to pressure me toward any particular outcome, understanding, as he told me repeatedly, that this decision needed to be entirely mine, made from a place of genuine clarity rather than either guilt or spite. I remember one specific evening during this period, sitting on our back porch long after Emma had gone to sleep, trying to articulate to Marcus the specific tangle of conflicting feelings I was navigating. Part of me feels like donating would just be proving her right, I told him, proving that I really am the family's designated helper, the one who gives without ever really receiving. But another part of me knows that if I don't do this and something happens to her, I'll carry that for the rest of my life, regardless of how she's treated me. Marcus listened without offering easy answers, understanding, I think, that this particular decision didn't have a clean, obviously correct resolution I simply needed help finding. My therapist, Dr. Whitfield, helped me understand something during this period that ultimately proved central to how I eventually approached the decision. That choosing to donate, if I ultimately made that choice, needed to be entirely separate from any question of forgiveness or reconciliation regarding the birthday party incident or the broader pattern of favoritism it represented. You can choose to save someone's life, she told me, during one particularly difficult session, without that choice requiring you to pretend the harm they've caused you doesn't exist, or obligating you to any particular emotional reconciliation you're not actually ready for. Those can be two completely separate decisions. I want to describe the specific conversation I eventually had with my mother, roughly 3 weeks after learning I was the only compatible match, a conversation I initiated specifically to establish clear boundaries around what donating would and wouldn't mean for our relationship going forward, before making any final decision about the transplant itself. I need you to understand something before I decide anything about this, I told her, sitting across from her hospital bed, her condition having stabilized somewhat through ongoing dialysis, but still requiring the eventual transplant to avoid long-term complications. If I do this, it's not because what happened at Emma's birthday is forgiven or forgotten. It's not because I'm suddenly agreeing that the way you've treated me my entire life was acceptable. If I donate, it's because I don't think choosing not to save your life, when I have the ability to, is who I actually want to be, regardless of how you've treated me. But I need you to understand that this decision doesn't erase decades of pattern, and it doesn't obligate me to pretend otherwise going forward. My mother's response to this conversation surprised me, carrying a fragility and genuine remorse I hadn't previously witnessed from her throughout my entire adult life. I know what I said at that party was unforgivable, she told me, her voice shaking. I've thought about it every single day since it happened. I don't have a good explanation for why I said it, except that I think, somewhere in myself, I've always felt guilty about how differently I treated you compared to Patrick and Jessica, and I think, in some twisted way, that guilt turned into resentment toward you specifically, blaming you for making me confront something uncomfortable about my own failures as a parent, rather than actually taking responsibility for it myself. I want to be honest that this explanation, while providing some additional context, didn't fully resolve my anger or fully explain away decades of documented, consistent, unequal treatment. But it did represent, as far as I could tell, a genuine attempt at accountability that I hadn't previously received from my mother throughout my entire life, and it factored, alongside considerable additional reflection, into my eventual decision. I ultimately chose to proceed with the kidney donation, a decision I made. I want to be clear, primarily based on my own values regarding the choice to save a life when I possessed the specific, rare ability to do so, rather than based on any full reconciliation or forgiveness regarding the broader pattern of mistreatment I'd experienced throughout my life. The transplant surgery took place roughly 2 months after that difficult hospital conversation, a successful procedure that restored my mother's kidney function and, medically speaking, gave her the prospect of many additional healthy years she wouldn't have otherwise had, at least not without the considerably harder, more uncertain path of the deceased donor waiting list. I want to describe my recovery from the donation surgery, a genuinely significant procedure in its own right, involving several weeks of limited activity and considerable physical discomfort, navigated largely with the support of Marcus and my own small circle of close friends, rather than the kind of sustained family support I understand from Jessica's own medical crises my mother had provided for my siblings during their respective difficult periods. I want to be honest that my relationship with my mother, in the time since the transplant, remains considerably more complicated and more carefully boundaried than what it was before the birthday party incident, even accounting for the genuine act of donation and her apparent remorse during that hospital conversation. I've maintained the specific boundary I established before deciding to donate, that my choice to save her life doesn't obligate me to pretend the underlying pattern of decades of favoritism simply doesn't exist, or to return to the same unequal dynamic that characterized most of my life before this crisis forced a more direct reckoning. We speak regularly now, and she has, to her credit, made what appears to be genuine, sustained effort to treat me with more consistent warmth and consideration than she demonstrated throughout most of my earlier adult life. She's made a point, several times over the past year, of celebrating achievements of mine she might once have overlooked, small gestures that, while they don't erase decades of pattern, do suggest at least some genuine, ongoing effort at change rather than a temporary adjustment that faded once the immediate crisis passed. I remain, admittedly, somewhat guarded about whether this shift represents a permanent, genuine change in the underlying pattern or simply a temporary adjustment prompted by the specific gravity of what I chose to do for her, understanding that only sustained time and consistency will actually reveal which explanation proves accurate. Jessica and Patrick, for their part, have both acknowledged, in conversations since the transplant, a clearer awareness of the favoritism pattern than either had previously expressed, though I've noticed that acknowledgement translating into only modest, gradual shifts in how our family dynamics actually function day to day. I try not to hold too tightly to expectations about how quickly or completely these patterns might change, understanding that decades of established family dynamics rarely transform completely, however genuine the underlying intentions toward improvement might be. If you've ever faced a situation where you were asked to provide significant support or sacrifice for someone who had treated you with sustained unfairness or cruelty, I want to hear how you navigated that particular ethical complexity. I used to believe that genuine forgiveness and practical, life-saving support needed to arrive together, that choosing to help someone inherently meant absolving them of accountability for how they'd previously treated you. I've learned, through this specific, difficult experience, that it's possible to hold both truths simultaneously, choosing to act according to your own deepest values regarding the preservation of human life, while still maintaining clear, honest boundaries about what that choice does and doesn't obligate you to feel or forgive going forward.